Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of 14th to 18th century poetry. The topic of today's lecture is Death Be Not Proud, and this is the sonnet by John Donne. I am your teacher Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Cohort University of Science and Technology. Dear students, discussion agenda for today's class is that first of all, I will give you introduction of this poem, and in this introduction we will also analyze the form and rhyme scheme of this sonnet. And after this introductory lines, I will give you line by analysis of first, second and third quatrain, and in the end we will analyze the last couplet of this sonnet. After this line by line analysis of the sonnet, I will identify some of the literary devices that are being used in this very poem, and you have to explain these concepts by yourself. That is the task which I have developed for you, and I will just identify the literary devices and you have to give me assignment on these very literary devices, and you have to explain these very literary devices in an assignment. Dear students, let's start. Death Be Not Proud. First of all, I will introduce the poet of this very sonnet. John Donne, you already know, is one of the prominent writer of 17th century. He was also a politician, lawyer and a priest, but he is most important metaphysical poet, and he is known for his metaphysical poetry. This sonnet was written by John Donne in 1609, and we see that this is the part of a series of sonnets which are often known as holy sonnets or divine sonnets. I already explained these very things to you in the introductory lecture on John Donne, that his poetry consists of different varieties, and one of the important variety of his poetry is that he included the holy and divine aspect in his poetry, and he did all these things in that way that later on he and his companions were identified as metaphysical poets. So, dear students, this very poem, Death Be Not Proud by John Donne, is a direct address to death. And in this poem, he is arguing that it is a powerless thing, because death acts merely as a short sleep, and this sleep is between earthly living and the eternal afterlife. So in essence, we can say that death is nothing to be feared. So that is the whole story that is being discussed in this sonnet, and this sonnet was written in 1609, but it was also published in 1633 after the death of John Donne. Now let's see form, meter and rhyme scheme of this poem. Death Be Not Proud is a sonnet, as I told you earlier, and this very sonnet is specifically close to the variety that was being followed by Patriarch, but it is not the complete copy of that sonnet pattern. Normally we see that sonnets are a fixed form that lend themselves well to arguments consisting of propositions, and then later on we see the response to those initial propositions. This sonnet is also grouped into two main sections. The first part is octet, and this octet comprises of 8 lines, and these 8 lines can be grouped into 2 quatrains. After this initial octet, we have a sestet, where the poem turns to offer its perspective on what has come before in the initial octet. The turn in this poem is very subtle, as this poem is primarily an intensification of argument against death as a powerful force. What is the poet's argument in this very poem? The argument of poet is that death is nothing to fear. So dear students, it has 14 lines, and the first 8 lines are named as octet, and the remaining 6 lines, which comprises of 1 quatrain and a couplet, is named as sestet. So this poem has a very strong argument against death as a powerful force. So this is a deliberate strategy that allows the argument to build increasing momentum towards the poem's concluding question in line number 12, and we see the response of this very question in the last 2 lines. So that is the form of this very poem. Now let's see that what is the meter of this poem. The meter in Death Be Not Proud is iambic pentameter throughout, but there are a few minor variations here. But the problem is that modern readers, they might struggle to hear the exact iambic pentameter clearly because of changes in the way certain words are pronounced in 17th century and the way we are pronouncing these words in this modern time. But we can see that line 5 gives an example of perfect iambic pentameter. In this line, from rest and sleep, which but thy picture be. Iambic pentameter, there are 5 feet. The first one is from rest. In this very foot, from is unstressed and rest is stressed syllable. In the same way, and sleep. And is unstressed, sleep is stressed. Which but. Which is unstressed, but is stressed. Thy pictures be. Thy unstressed, pitch is stressed. Chers be. Chers is unstressed and be is stressed. So in this way we have 5 feet and the pattern is unstressed, stressed. So this very poem is following iambic pentameter. But there are some deviations and variations also there, and you might also struggle to hear the exact pentameter, but as I have told you that there are some changes in the pronunciation of certain words, but actually this very poem is in iambic pentameter. Now let's see the rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme of the first 8 lines, that is named as octet, follows the pattern ABBA, ABBA. This is the typical scheme that is found in Petrarchan sonnets, but the sestet diverges from that normal Petrarchan pattern, and it rhymes CDDC, and the last couplet is EE. So the rhyming scheme of this very sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, CDDC, and the last couplet is EE. This is the rhyme scheme of death, be not proud. Now let's move towards the line-by-line analysis of this poem. Dear students, first of all, I will read the lines from this sonnet, and then I will present the analysis of these lines. So let's start from the first two lines. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Here we see the speaker very immediately creates a personified version of death. And we see that the speaker is directly talking to death. Death. He is addressing death. Be not proud. And we see that he paints a picture of death as an arrogant being and one who needs to be humble. So the poet is painting death as an arrogant being. And we see that the speaker, he assumes the position of the person who must humble this very proud being. And that proud being is death. He tells him that he ought not to be so proud, even though for generations people have feared death and called him mighty and dreadful. Here you see, the poet says, death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. Poet is saying that though from generations people have feared death and called him mighty and dreadful, but the speaker, with a very powerful, authoritative voice, he is saying and he is declaring this very thing, thou art not so. He is challenging death. Here we see that poet is using apostrophe, and apostrophe occurs when the writer addresses a subject who cannot respond. Here we see that he is talking to death, but death is not replying that speaker. So when we read this sonnet, we very immediately come to know that this sonnet will consist of one speaker who will do all of the talking on the subject. Though we see that here in this sonnet death is very effectively personified, but that death cannot respond to the charges of the speaker, and he is not answering what is being charged against him or what is being blamed against him. Here I am using the masculine gender for death, and we will continue this very masculine gender throughout this poem. So death, be not proud, thou some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. So this is the beginning of this sonnet. Now let's move towards the line number 3 and 4. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. Here the poet again blames the death of having a false impression of power and grandeur, because the poet claims that death thinks that he has the power to kill. He actually does not have this power. In the initial discussion, we see that the speaker tries to humble death by telling him that his idea that he has the power to overthrow lives is simply an illusion, and that he has no such powers at all. We see that the speaker or the poet, he is continuously humiliating death. Here we see that the speaker calls him poor death. It sounds almost as if the speaker is making fun of death, because he is saying that, "O death, you have lived under the illusion that you have any sort of power over the life or death." After this initial humiliation of the death, once again the speaker addresses death, but this time we see that he is addressing in a more personal manner, and the speaker is some sort of challenging death by saying, "Yet canst thou kill me." Apparently it seems dangerous for one to threaten death in this way. However, we see that the knowledge of John Donne's background and ideologies can give some insight into the speaker's confidence here, because John Donne is having a very strong ideological background. Though everyone knows that physical death does indeed occur to human beings, but here the speaker is challenging death in a very different way. He uses that very religious concept of eternity to mock or to humiliate death by telling him, "Even if you take my physical body, you can never truly kill me." Because we see that in Christianity, even in Islam, we have this belief that when we die, after that we move to an eternal life. This is not the actual death. Actually, we pass away from this humanly or earthly life to that eternal and heavenly life. In line number 5 and 6, the poet says, "From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow." In this poem's second quatrain, the speaker's argument enters its second stage. While the first quatrain established the poem's main point of contention, that death should not be proud, because it is not mighty or dreadful, the next few lines deal specifically with the evidence that support these very claims which the speaker has done in the initial lines. The speaker compares rest and sleep to death. "From rest and sleep, which thy pictures be." And here he is suggesting that these two things, rest and sleep, are images of the death. This is part of overall project to diminish the death's power. What the poet is doing? He is trying to reduce, he is trying to squeeze the death's power. Rest and sleep are first and foremost entirely very humble and harmless activities. In fact, they are absence of activities. When we are resting or when we are sleeping, actually there is absence of activities. And in sleep case, we see that there is a switching off of the conscious living. In addition to that, both rest and sleep have great benefits, and these are very essential for the life. If we somehow miss these very things, for example rest or sleep, it becomes very difficult to continue our life. These very things are very essential to life. So they are at once harmless activities. In the same way, these are the basic needs of our daily routine. And these two are important ways for people to maintain and restore good health. Rest and sleep are the components of our life to maintain and restore good health. So they are the necessary moments of inactivity that make activity possible. Here we see according to the speaker, who equates these two things with pleasure. Rest and sleep make people feel good. If death is just the heightened version of rest and sleep, then there is nothing to fear from it. Normally, we see that people feel fear from death. But if death is just a form of rest and sleep, then there is nothing to fear from it. So we see that when he linked death with rest and sleep in the previous sentences, now the speaker proceeds to the next stage in the logic of the argument which he is presenting in this sonnet. If rest and sleep bring people's pleasure, then death must be more pleasurable, being the kind of heightened and intensified version of them. As the poet is saying, from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasures than from thee much more must flow. Rest and sleep are pleasures, and death is the heightened form of rest and sleep. Then there must be more pleasure, and we will have a heightened and intensified version of enjoyment and happiness from death. So here, briefly, the speaker is praising death for bringing this big sleep to people. In the initial lines, the speaker and the poet was humiliating death, but here they are praising death for bringing the big sleep to the people. In line number 7 and 8, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. The speaker says that the best men seem to experience death the soonest. We also hear this very statement even in Pakistani society, that good people die in their early age. But most of the time people question this belief, that why it seems as if the best people die soonest. Here we see that the speaker is offering an answer. And the speaker is suggesting that the best among men deserves to experience the peaceful rest of death sooner, without tolerating the miseries and sufferings of long life on the earth. The speaker describes death as rest of their bones, and bones refers to the physical body. So we see that Donne says that death is a rest of physical body, and for soul is a delivery, rebirth of spiritual being. For soul it is a rebirth of spiritual being. So rest of their bones and soul's delivery, it is a delivery for the soul. Both of these descriptions make death seems like a welcome friend who comes to offer rest and peace to that very person whom he meets, and in this way he releases or liberates one's soul from the earthly body, where we see that the soul and the body is suffering pain and miseries. So in this way the poet is saying that death is a form of transition from temporary life which we are living here on this planet Earth to the eternal life. So this poem plays on this with the word delivery, hinting at a kind of birth rather than death. So here delivery is suggesting that, hinting that it is a kind of birth rather than death. Now let's see line number 9 and 10. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness devour. Here the speaker comes with a stronger tone, and he begins to taunt and ridicule death with more intensity than he did in the initial lines, because here he calls death a slave to chance, kings, and desperate men. He tells death that he is not mighty and dreadful, but rather a poor slave who cannot even act on his own, but is driven not only by faith and chance, but we see that even those people who are desperate, though they may be rich or poor, death is slave to them. He then accuses death of having companionship with very lowly things, with very down things such as poison, war, and sickness. So the speaker has taunted, ridiculed, humiliated death by telling him that he is not to be feared, but rather that he is a slave to the will of faith and desperate men, and that as lowly slaves, his companions are even lowlier beings as sickness and war and poison. So these acquisitions serves to allow the readers to feel a sense of power and victory over death. The speaker certainly feels authority over death, and he passes his feeling along to his readers when he puts death in the place by talking down to him. In line number 11 and 12, we see that the poet says, "And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then?" The speaker continues to taunt death even more here. This creates the sense of an addition of reasons as to why death is so powerless. And he suggests that the speaker could name more things like death, for example, poppy and charms. The speaker points out that all that death brings is a little sleep, and he does not even do that as well as some other bringers of the rest, such as poppy and charms, do their function. So in this comparison, he further portrays death as something not only weak, but even pleasurable. The speaker questions death and asks, "Why swell'st thou then?" In this very question, he is asking him why he is so much puffed up with pride when he cannot even do his job as well as others can, as poppy and charms are doing their job. Death is not doing that very thing in that better manner. So the poet is taunting death, even asking him that why you are so proud. You are not doing your job in a good manner. In the last couplet, "One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." In these final lines of the sonnet, "Death, be not proud," the speaker reveals exactly why he has been taunting death so persistently. Although it is very clear that death is a reality, and that people who experience death do not come back to earth, but we see that the speaker reveals his reason for claiming that death is weak and easily overcome. He claims that death is only one short sleep, and that those who experience death, they wake up eternally. Then he claims that death shall be no more. When the human beings will wake up eternally in the life hereafter, then there will be no death. So finally, the poet declares that, and he tells death, "Thou shalt die." So the speaker has not only told death that he has no real powers over anyone, but that he will experience the end of himself when all wake up in eternity, and then we see that death will be no more. So here the poet is again referring to that religious belief that when all human beings will wake up on the day of judgment, and there is the belief that then death will be no more. So here in this poem, the poet is addressing death and arguing that it is powerless because it acts merrily as a short sleep between earthly living and the eternal afterlife. So in essence, we can say that death is nothing to be feared. Dear students, this is the line-by-line analysis of Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. I have identified some of the literary devices in this sonnet. This sonnet is basically an apostrophe, and I already explained apostrophe, that what type of address is apostrophe. The second thing is that in the very first line we see personification, death be not proud. So the poet is using a literary device of personification here. I highlighted some other literary devices too in this poem, like one new literary device I am introducing here for you students, and that is sibilance. And you see that I have highlighted in blue color the letter S and these hissing sounds which are there in some of the words that you can see. So sibilance is a figure of speech in which a hissing sound is created. You will mark all these letters, and in this way you can identify the sibilance in this poem. Synecdoche is a figure of speech which is being used by John Donne here. Rest of their bones. Bones is a word which is basically a part, and here these bones represent the whole human body. So synecdoche is being used here. In the same way we see anaphora, repetition of and in the beginning of these lines. Basically this is an anaphora. There is a paradox in the 14th line. We have a rhetorical question in the line number 12. In the same way you can identify a number of other literary devices. So this is a task for you, that you have to explain the literary devices which I have identified for you. Even you can identify more literary devices in this very poem, and you have to give me an assignment on this topic. Thank you very much for listening passionately. I hope that now you will be clear about the sonnet Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. Allah Hafiz.